Action Hour, WEAN's Executive Director Marnie Jackson joins us to give our community a programmatic update before we take a hiatus from the podcast for the summer. We talked about doing this episode because we're juggling quite a few different projects and want to make sure the WEAN community is given an update on all the things that are happening behind the scenes. So thanks for being back with us, Marnie, and I'm happy to have you here.
Thanks. It's really great to be with you. And as you've shared, there's a lot going on, and I'm excited about talking about that. I'd love for more people to have visibility into how busy we are and all the high impact programming that is going on right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like this podcast has been an outlet for education in a lot of ways, but we haven't had as many conversations about the actual programmatic work that we're doing. And I think this is just a really good opportunity to give people insight into that and to specifically give people insight into how we are really setting the organization up to be a voice for islands in Washington State. So you and I talk about this a lot, but I think that, you know, that's kind of the direction that we're heading on the highest level, is to really position ourselves to speak for our islands at every level of government possible. And in that kind of vein, you know, I don't know, we have a little bullet list of things we want to make sure we talk about today. But unless you have an objection, I kind of wanted to start with the comprehensive plan.
Absolutely. And if I may just interject, I can hear my dogs in the background. And if anybody else hears my dogs, know that they are joyfully playing in the other room. Those are not distress sounds. And I just want to apologize because I do have a puppy in the house, and I can hear her trying to instigate a romp with one of our elders.
You know, I think we've done a couple of episodes on the comprehensive plan. And so for anybody listening who hasn't listened to those episodes, we did 2 episodes on the comprehensive plan at the state level and kind of what the comprehensive planning process is and why it matters. And we've also done a few episodes specifically on critical areas ordinances, because those are outlined by our comprehensive plan in the second code development aspect of that process. And right now we're in a phase. What is the phase? Okay. What is the phase we're technically in?
So that's the thing. It's rather hard to say because, you know, the original public participation plan as published by Island County talked about a phase of shaping the plan, followed by a phase of refining the plan, followed by a third phase of finalizing the plan. And we've been told by planners that we're completed with the shaping and that we're now in the refining. And yet we haven't seen any complete draft except for the Clinton sub-area. And so that's been a source of some frustration for me personally, and I think for other members of our community around really holding this big question around what input has been integrated, whether the community's voice has been heard about some of these important topics like aquifer recharge protection, and then what will appear in the final draft, or I should say the final version for which we have not yet seen a draft.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that particular frustration that you mentioned is acute at the moment because as an organization, we are working on providing feedback on every element of the comprehensive plan, within the public comment period, and not having drafts, full drafts available has made that feedback pretty challenging, I would say.
Yes. And, I wonder if listeners are aware of just how much we were able to collaborate with some of our partner organizations to get us thus far in comprehensive planning.
Oh, yeah. Definitely mention the consortium.
Yeah, we did co-apply and receive grant funding in consortium with other local nonprofits. So Goosefoot was our fiscal sponsor, and Island Roots Housing and the Agricultural Resources Committee of Island County were our consortium partners. And between us, our 4 organizations got funded to do a fair bit of work around engaging the public in comprehensive planning, surveying the public about their values and needs, and then particularly having some subcontractors assist us in bringing an equity lens to the comprehensive plan. So we were fortunate to have the work of Mary Elizabeth Himes, who did outreach efforts in Oak Harbor and beyond to reach members of the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color population, as well as the efforts of Diana Sandoval, who took a look at the comprehensive plan written language and assessed it from an equity perspective for opportunities for improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a really great grant opportunity and a really great group to work with. And I would say that it would have been really nice for the county's timeline and our timeline for grant funding to be in alignment.
It would have been. Our grant proposal and our deliverable deadlines were built around the county's proposed plan. Mm-hmm. And the original concept was to sync activities pretty tightly. So our deliverables were phased exactly with the county's deliverables. That said, the county's timeline changed and a new public participation plan was never published. So we really weren't able to revise our grant with any specificity. Mm-hmm. And so what ended up happening was that the final deliverable deadline was just the very same week that draft goals and policies were released. So in fact, we had no opportunity to do any grant-funded public engagement around that first goals and policies draft release.
Yeah. I mean, that said, we are committed to public engagement, as an organization. And so I think we are still spending our time making sure that the public and our specific WEAN community can engage in the process the best we can. But yeah, it is really disappointing that they haven't updated their public participation plan and that they were not able to give us any kind of heads up as a partner organization about the changes that were happening. And they really just, I mean, I don't want us to spend this whole episode talking about the failures of Island County's public participation plan. We can maybe have a different episode about that.
Well, what I think we hope for and what gives me a real sense of optimism is that being funded by the Department of Commerce through this Climate Commitment Act funding mm-hmm. gave us an opportunity to provide feedback directly to the Department of Commerce about how community engagement was going in Island County. Mm-hmm. And one thing I really, really hope for is that the lessons learned here will be extrapolated across many counties and will actually result in improved guidance for counties about how to plan. Yeah. And I really hope and believe that the way that Island County has been challenged in this process and the way that Island County constituents have been left out in many ways mm-hmm. will end up being an education for the Department of Commerce about what counties need in terms of opportunities and education and support, but also what counties need in terms of accountability and really being held to keep their promises.
I have that hope too. I do think that as somebody who, as engagement director and thinking about how to engage people is one of my primary focuses, I do think that communication, education, and outreach is something that needs to be properly budgeted for. And I would be very interested to see Island County's budget for this comprehensive planning process and whether public engagement was really budgeted for at all. And if so, where'd they put that money? Because it really does just seem like it was an afterthought. And that is, I hope, hopefully that feedback can be given to the Department of Commerce in a way that provides, like you said, provides better guidance and support in the process, not thinking of the community as an afterthought.
Right.
But yeah, I guess what's interesting is to bring it to a different process and a different project we're working on. We are also a part of a coalition at the state level that's engaging in the Shoreline Management Act rulemaking process. So while we are providing feedback on the county level on the comprehensive planning process through the Growth Management Act, we are also providing feedback to the Department of Ecology for the Shoreline Management Act. And that has been a very different process, I would say.
It has been. Mm-hmm. I would say, first of all, I'm learning so much from our partners. We have programmatic partners working at the state level who have, staff attorneys and staff policy directors and, people who've been doing this work for years or decades. And so as folks who are newer to working explicitly in environmental policy, I would say both you and I are likely learning a lot, but I would say we're also contributing. And I've been pleasantly surprised at how much unique insight you and I have from our island resident perspective that's really missing in the conversation without our voices. And I've really appreciated that the staff from the Department of Ecology who meet with us are genuinely curious about our insights. And what we see is our input reflected in the drafts that they release. And, I haven't had the opportunity yet to comb through every word of the draft that was just released, but I get a sense that in this draft rulemaking process, they have taken some of our advice to heart. They have indicated places where there are changes, and they've indicated why. And I love the specificity with which they release drafts because they announce it to the public very clearly with very clear instructions about how to engage. B, they show both the clean copy and the marked up copy of what's changing so that you can see where it's been and where it's heading. And that's not dissimilar from how the county released their draft goals and policies in the sense that they did show the clean copy or the marked up copy of draft goals and policies. With the SMA rulemaking, what I love seeing is the comments in context. So as part of a full narrative, because context matters so much for for some of this language.
Yeah, I feel like the Department of Ecology has really given the public insight into their decision-making process and where what they're referencing when they are making certain choices or changes. And yeah, I think they've really been open and transparent with us. And I agree that they seem to actually genuinely want feedback from people. And, it is interesting to be in those rooms as someone newer to policy, someone going through a rulemaking process for the first time. But like you said, with a very clear understanding that islands need to be represented in this process. We have a huge amount of shoreline, and we are really being impacted by climate realities and will continue to be. And so we really need our voices to be heard at the state level as it pertains to everything that has to do with the shorelines. And, us and the San Juans, I would say, have a lot of skin in the game, So
true.
Yeah.
Just the other day, I was in a meeting with a number of partners from the Department of Natural Resources at not Island County, but Washington State Department of Natural Resources, Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife, program partners from Friends of the San Juans. And somebody from Friends of the San Juans very wisely said that without addressing some of these enforcement gaps, a lot of this policy is really just encouraging us to endorse incremental damage. And, a lot of the guidance around shoreline armoring is just metering the damage, metering the habitat loss, slowing it down. But until we have a real removal and restoration plan, or until we have enforcement and true mitigation to a standard of net gain of ecological function, rather than just this loosely aspired to standard of no net loss, we really aren't going to see the restoration of the salmon runs and the restoration of the orca and all the things that are implicit in the food web. So what we're facing is really this slow marching death of our shoreline ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And unless we get serious about it as a true environmental catastrophe, it's going to be extremely hard to preserve some of those cherished beings in our ecosystems.
Yeah, that's very well said. I would say that that's, one of the primary reasons why I was interested in being a part of the coalition, the Shoreline Management Act Coalition, was because enforcement was up for rulemaking review. And, I really see rules around enforcement as a way to create greater protection for ecosystem functioning. But I think enforcement is an issue at every level.
It
when
really
it comes to environmental policy, it's how do you enforce these policies that you have created? What are the mechanisms of accountability?
Even today, I was just going through line by line the goals and policies draft for Island County's natural resources element. Mm-hmm. Again and again, I saw opportunities to strengthen the language or retain important language that's proposed for removal, but none of it is meaningful without enforcement. Really, if one has a good rule on the books and nobody follows it and there's no penalty for failing to follow it, is there a purpose to the rule at all? And so it's partly a resource question in terms of the size of the tax base, the budget of the county, the allocation of resources, which generally fall along values lines. The old adage is, if you want to know my values, look at my budget. Mm-hmm. But there's also the question around will. Even if resources could be assigned to the topic of enforcement, for instance, financial penalties could be an incentive to not do harm. And yet our county is not particularly invested in using financial penalties to avoid harm. So even if the funding is available, or if there's a model that could make the funding available, there doesn't seem to be a will to enforce. And without that will, the laws on the books are virtually meaningless.
I love that you bring up will. John Levy and I talked about political will as it pertains to bulkheads in particular, and basically reshaping our thought process as a community towards a managed retreat or relocation. And he was like, there's no political will for this, right? Like that's like the big hurdle. And, and when will is shown, sometimes elected officials do not listen, like when it comes to Oak Harbor, right? Like, for those of you listening who don't know, we are currently in an appeal process with the city of Oak Harbor in a case that's related to an ordinance that they passed last year, Ordinance 1999, which initially they were looking to remove the right of the city's residents to vote on the disposition of parkland. And I think ultimately they greatly diminished that right. I don't think they removed it entirely. And they did all of that without following the proper SEPA process, which is what we're appealing about. But as it pertains to political will, the city council received over 100 public comments saying very clearly that people would like to keep their right to vote and that they thought it was really important to keep. And the city council voted against it anyway.
It's so true. And one of my greatest sources of frustration in relation to that experience was that some city council members asserted that the ability to make public comment during a hearing is how the community has power. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there was no need of a vote because community voice would be present during any hearing about such a sale. Mm-hmm. Yet, community voice was profoundly unified around this issue, and community voice was ignored. And the council voted to move in entirely opposite direction from community will. And then, to add insult to injury, I think there's been this potential framing of the contest around this question as really being about one park or one site or even one proposed development. Mm-hmm. There is a proposed development downtown in Oak Harbor of a Hilton. That Hilton could have been constrained to its original footprint. Mm-hmm. In fact, previous proposed developments on that site would have fit very nicely within the footprint of the available parcel. There were steps at which the city encouraged expansion beyond that footprint and mm-hmm. wanted to see proposals that would have overflowed into public parkland. Mm-hmm. And it basically came to a head when the law requiring a vote of the people to dispose of parkland threatened to interrupt this agreement with a developer. And so I have had community members ask for clarification around whether we are, anti-hotel, anti-downtown development. And we are very much pro-urban development in a responsible manner because we need vital cities that are livable, that accommodate the residents and the city's industry and commerce that supports those residents. Mm-hmm. And so a big part of what we advocate for in terms of urban space is beautiful, thriving, growing cities that actually meet more people's needs and better, which is part of how we protect rural areas from sprawl.
Yeah, all of these things are interconnected, right? Like comprehensive planning is mandated by the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act was passed in 1990 with quite a few goals that are competing in some ways. But one of those main goals is to reduce sprawl in rural areas. And, urban revitalization and development in a responsible way is in alignment with what we want in order to protect ecosystems, in order to protect open spaces, to have wildlife corridors, to have, buffers for fire resilience, to, respect our wetlands. Like all of those things are compatible with urban revitalization. And urban communities need urban ecosystems and they need parks. They need parkland. Like people cannot live in a city that doesn't have green space. It's both not great for mental health and well-being. It's not great for, recreational reasons. And also in terms of climate resilience, it's required in terms of maintaining heat. I think that there's this real lack of understanding of how living in a concrete jungle or like how asphalt and like permeable, or what is it like?
Impervious
surfaces create mm-hmm. heat domes.
Right.
That have real consequences. And so like, I feel like we've really been positioned by the city council as this group that just like hates this hotel. And meanwhile, what we're really thinking about is they made a decision without following, without having to do an environmental impact statement, not thinking that this choice that they were making is going to have an impact on all parks in the future of now and in the future of Oak Harbor.
Right. Right. And, the reason that the proposed Hilton comes into the conversation is that one does have a legal obligation to consider the momentum that is building towards a certain project mm-hmm. when making a non-project action SEPA determination. So the State Environmental Policy Act, one is required under certain terms to make a determination of whether it has environmental significance or no environmental significance, or sometimes environmental significance with mitigation. Mm-hmm. And making that determination for an action that is not related to a project, such as the changing of a law or an ordinance, there is a requirement to consider if there's momentum towards a certain very specific project action being a likely outcome of this change, that has to be considered in the environmental impact assessment. And so really, that's why we mentioned this hotel. It's not that we don't want the hotel. It's not that the hotel isn't possible or even responsible and desirable. We have not fully analyzed the project proposal. It hasn't been brought to a state where it's ready to be fully analyzed. But the law changing is so much bigger and broader than this one site. And that's really what required an environmental assessment and didn't get it. And that robs the community of the opportunity to really weigh in at this important juncture.
Yes. It robs the community of the opportunity to weigh in at a really important pivotal moment in the development of Oak Harbor, especially because that city is positioned to take on the greatest number of residents in the future. And that's complicated. I mean, I do understand that like there are tensions between our municipalities and the county, right? In terms of what the county is mandated to do by the state, and then what the county is then asking municipalities to do. And, you know, I know that like in part of what has been stalling the comprehensive planning process is that Oak Harbor, was it specifically that they like didn't want to accept the number of residents, or was it that they hadn't changed their zoning codes to match?
My understanding, and it's potentially not a complete understanding because I haven't had time to analyze this issue as fully as I'd like, but my understanding is that the population targets for housing types by income band, so the housing types that are affordable for lower income families and middle income families, basically require Oak Harbor to adapt its zoning to accommodate more multifamily housing.
Yes.
And so think about apartment buildings or triplexes or fourplexes. And so my understanding is that the city has said that it is technically impossible to accommodate that level of growth, and especially that growth for lower and middle income families. These are the working families that run the businesses that make the city livable. However, in looking at what's possible with rezoning, there's so much potential inside the city of Oak Harbor for some vast tracts of land to be repurposed for higher and better service. And there's actually been a tension around how to attract responsible developers to the city. And, you know, one of the critiques that I've heard of the city is that they're a tough partner to work with in terms of partnering to develop land. And I just see that as something that could be addressed by thoughtfully rezoning certain areas and by incentivizing responsible development by, for instance, I've heard of jurisdictions offering a one-floor bonus for buildings that have a green roof, which allows not only the climate and cooling impacts of that green roof to lower the energy needs in that building. It also provides urban habitat for wildlife and pollinators. It improves the experience of residents, and it gives developers a height bonus so that they can create more units and have a better price per unit price point for redeveloping that site. And so one of the big tensions between the county and the city right now is the city is saying we don't have capacity for these housing allocations unless we expand our urban growth area.
Yeah, that was it. The expansion. I was like, what was it?
It's the expansion of the urban growth area, and the proposed expansion. We've seen a map of the proposed expansion, and it includes areas that have already been wrestled over and fought for and protected, such as areas that have been designated as areas of long-term rural significance. The fact that they're still talking about expanding the urban growth boundary into areas that have been identified as being vital for the character and integrity of our Whidbey Island experience, just it's a frustrating waste of resources to fight the same fight again. And what I hope for is for the county's analysis of those population projections to give us real insight into how much Oak Harbor can grow and give us real data about whether an urban growth area boundary adjustment is necessary. And then if it is necessary, that it be done sensitively in the areas that are logical extensions of the city, as opposed to areas that are already precious and beloved for other purposes.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But it makes me also think about like the issues that we're having on the south end with septic and water capacity, like our infrastructure, right? There's this question of like land expansion. And then there's this also these other questions about like, do we have the infrastructure to support population growth? If so, at what scale? And is the number that we've chosen, is it really reasonable? Like in a larger sense to, you know, I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
Well, you know, the way population projections are handled with the Growth Management Act, the Department of Commerce basically gives counties choices around whether they want to estimate conservatively or estimate generously about what population growth might come. And so it's less about saying we want this many more thousands of people to come. It's more about saying we hypothesize that this many more people will come. And in planning, we need to be prepared to be able to meet the needs of those people if they come. So saying we're going to get X number of people in the next 20 years doesn't obligate us to build that many houses immediately or run that many sewer lines immediately, but it does obligate us to have a plan and a very real concept of how would sewer be handled for that many more people? How would housing be allocated and where would it go for that many more people? And very essentially in this update to the GMA, how would the ability to live in Island County be distributed fairly across income bands? So we know that Island County has attracted and continues to attract people of high economic means. There are many people who have a second or third home on Whidbey Island or on Camano Island. But is Island County a practical and accessible community for people earning low wage in the service industry, people who are our teachers or our healthcare professionals who are middle income families looking for a starter home, for example? And so we know we have issues around economic access to homeownership in this county, and increasing the availability of the housing stock is one way to do that. But unlike our mainland counties, where they have a lot of land per capita, we have an incredibly finite and shrinking amount of land, because not only are we on islands with distinct shores, but with sea level rise, many of our coastal neighborhoods are going to become inhospitable and uninhabitable within our lifetime. And so we're dealing with the dual challenge of fitting more people into a county that has underserving infrastructure. So we don't have a sewer system in Freeland, even though it's a non-municipal urban growth area. We don't have a funding plan for how to get that sewer into that city. And we potentially need to accommodate coastal dwellers moving inland over the next generation, as well as people coming from the mainland to this place. Yeah,
which, you know, to me, I think that I would love at some point for there to be a conversation on the state level about how the Growth Management Act can consider the specific needs of islands, and to factor some of the geological, coastal, cultural elements that are special to these places, both us and the San Juans. Because I do think that it is a complicated puzzle. And while I hear you that the population projection is a plan and not an actual, is not saying that we're going to have that number of people, I do think every time they've made a projection, they've reached it, as far as I understand. So, how you plan matters. Whether or not you say, oh, we have a roadmap now, we're going to allow all these developers. You know what I mean? Like there's a way in which it's like, if you build it, they will come.
Well, and there's a real need to rethink as a broader society, but also as a microcosmos on Whidbey and Camano Islands, to rethink how we live and what we consider to be normal. And so things like, we know we have a sole source aquifer, and we know that this water source is critical and finite. And we know that it is recharged by rainwater falling on forests, among other things. Yep. But rainwater falling on pervious surfaces, natural surfaces that absorb, that is functionally how our aquifer gets recharged. And we've been reassured again and again by our staff hydrogeologists that, there's plenty of water. We just need to focus on changing the leaks in the systems, which is an important additional factor. We do have aging water infrastructure, and that's potentially a looming public health crisis that needs to be addressed. But the inputs into the system also need to be addressed, because when a droplet of water falls on the forest, it sinks into that tree, which is carbon sequestration. The part that is not absorbed by that tree goes into the ground. It may take 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, but it's going to make it back into the aquifer and eventually back out into our taps. But the minute that droplet falls on concrete, it's changed from an asset into a threat, and it can carry topsoil off the island. Stormwater creates erosion, pollutes our waterways, carries runoff into the sound. And so if we could just focus on not just encouraging, but mandating low impact development, pervious surfaces, water capture and recharge function, landscaping for water capture. If all of this runoff from our structures and our roads could be processed through biological systems so it can re-enter the aquifer, we would go a long way towards addressing this community fear around not knowing what our aquifer recharge capacity is. And meanwhile, as we witness, timber harvest being prioritized in our county code, despite the fact that this county has already been designated as having no lands of long-term commercial significance, we really need land use planning and land use tax programs that incentivize and value the conservation value of retaining healthy forests and native plant communities as a public benefit, as a public health contributor.
Yeah. I do think that there are a lot of ways in which we have to, as a society, really drastically shift our mindset around the way we live, the way we build, what our expectations are around what success looks like.
It's true. If you think about, many years ago when the city of Langley was contemplating its major sewer infrastructure, our founders, Marion and Steve, brought forth a proposal that the city residents be equipped by the city with high-tech, modern composting toilets, and that there would be an employee of the city, a staff sanitation worker, whose job it would be to go around and collect the collected material from those composting toilets and take it to some kind of a municipal composting facility. And, it could be arranged in such a manner that it was hygienic and safe and met public health standards. And the city could have offered grants to cover the cost of those bathroom retrofits for every single person in the city at a price point that would have been dramatically lower than the cost of installing a sewer system. And then instead of basically dealing with solid waste as a biohazard and liquid waste as a thing to be processed and spit into the sound, we would have been dealing with that waste as a resource that could have been turned into, a fertilizer source and returned to the earth. And although I'm no expert on composting toilet technology, I know there are people doing it very successfully and creating a byproduct that is actually a net gain for either agricultural or ecosystem use to add fertility back to our soil. And I think that we have this cultural squeamishness about waste where we've basically decided we want it to just go flush away, out of sight, out of mind. But the waste exists and is processed one way or the other. And could we, as a society, get around to wanting to process it in partnership with nature and in a way that benefits nature?
I think I think that's a really interesting concept, which makes me think about the municipal composting project that David Haskell was trying to get off the ground, and just the fact that as a county, we don't have municipal compost. And, I think his research said that maybe 40% of the waste that goes off the island to the Roosevelt landfill is organic waste. And it's just creating methane and generating waste and not regenerative at all. And, I do think there are a lot of, there just are so many, I think in terms of planning, there are just so many little things to think about and ways that we could be improving our relationship with the natural world. And we have a lot of work to do that way. I wanted to circle back to you mentioning sea level rise, because something that's been top of mind. It's something that I think everybody in this island is thinking about. Anybody who lives in a coastal town is thinking about. And we just, we've been following this one particular permit application for a bulkhead on the north end of the island. I'd love for you to explain to me when we started following this case and where we're at now.
Sure. So I know that there are concerned citizens who have been following this case for as far back as 4 or 5 years ago, possibly even further back. I know that there were some activities related to this parcel in 2021 that prior generation of WEAN leadership flagged and commented upon. In 2023, there was an application for a bulkhead that would have basically spanned 5 parcels in an area that is adjacent to sensitive dune habitat. And that habitat is home to a threatened moth, which has only a couple of sites, habitat sites in the state. And if it loses this one habitat site, it could have a dramatic impact on the ability of the species to survive. And so WEAN raised its objections in a thorough memo to the county at that time. That application was in 2023. And then a series of procedural missteps and hearings and postponements and follow-up hearings and such ensued. And the outcome thus far has been that as of last week, the application for building these bulkheads was approved, pending the approval of the Department of Ecology, Washington State, which will happen over the span of the coming months, or I should say, which will be sought, and I hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah, but it's a conditional use permit, right?
Yeah, and there are some really troubling aspects to this case, including getting around the standard that one does not put hard armoring on an undeveloped shoreline parcel. Yeah, doing a lot boundary line adjustment and lot combination. So if you can extrapolate the precedent that this sets to other uses, you can imagine anyone who can afford to acquire and amalgamate adjacent shoreline parcels could functionally create the conditions where they would be permitted to armor that previously vacant parcel. And so it's rewarding wealth, it's rewarding consolidation of parcels at the expense of ecosystems. And although I agree that these lots are inappropriately small, that this site has been subdivided to substandard levels in a previous generation before the zoning was what it is today, I don't think that consolidating them for the purposes of armoring them is in alignment with the purpose of the law. And I'm really troubled by the precedent that sets. So one thing I'm excited about, or I should say one thing that gives me heart in this case, is that this case is on the radar of some pretty smart program partners and people working at the Department of Ecology who realize the threat that this poses to our coastal ecosystems. I hope that they are watching closely and will intervene. I know that there are program partners and tribes with interest in this, and people who realize the potential impact of this, not only for the one bulkhead, but also the cumulative impact from the precedent this sets. Mm-hmm. And so I just really hope that Island County will engage in a lawful, complete process. They did not issue a notice of having made a State Environmental Policy Act threshold determination. If they did, it was in 2023, and it was not a final decision. It was a notice that indicated a likelihood of making a determination of non-significance. Mm-hmm. And so procedurally, there seems to be a missed step around notifying the public through the paper of record and through the state SEPA register about that decision having been made, and opening a public comment period about that decision. Because a decision of non-significance for this particular site, which is adjacent to public land, a rare ecosystem, and a threatened species, it's just nonsensical.
Yeah, I also think that I'm curious as to whether or not even a soft plan for a determination of non-significance 2 years ago really would hold. Like, are all of the conditions the same today? Like, could you really say that?
Well, the funny thing is, we've looked at the SEPA register from 2 years ago, and had they noticed at that time, had they issued a public notice at that time indicating that the public comment period was opening for this proposed DNS, determination of non-significance, had they done that, procedurally, that might have sufficed. I don't know the intricacies of the law enough to say if that the likelihood of that decision being announced to the public is equal to that actual decision being announced to the public. Mm-hmm. But they did not appear in the SEPA register at that time. Mm-hmm. So no notice was given at that time, to the best of our knowledge, based on the records that are available to us. We only got notice of this current decision because we're a party of record, because we had objected 2 years ago. We had asked to be a party of record, and we were emailed by planners, which we appreciate. We appreciate that they adhered to the law in notifying us as a party of record. But the general public is also legally required to be notified. And there may be neighbors who are concerned with this case. There may be state park users or state park staff or legislators who want to protect their state park as a resource.
Right. Or the people who are funding the restoration projects that are happening right around that area.
Absolutely. There are agencies and NGOs and individual volunteers who are contributing to trying to sustain the conditions for life for that threatened moth. Mm-hmm. And if any of them were to have the opportunity to comment publicly on this application, they may well do so. But so far, the public notice has not been issued.
Yeah. Well, everyone stay tuned on that one. We'll certainly.
Staying on the topic of shorelines, I will say I've been so heartened to see how seriously Washington State is taking these questions.
Yes.
And, it's a big body of work. There's a lot to consider. There are a lot of intersecting challenges ranging from, impact on coastal communities of sea level rise, preservation of homes and property, which is one potential goal, removal and rebuilding of homes and property in a less vulnerable site is another potential goal. As you mentioned, there isn't really political will for that yet, although there are precedents for that. There are communities who've gotten up and moved in other places. Mm-hmm. And then there are the site-by-site restoration projects, a lot of which are collaborations between tribes and state agencies. Mm-hmm. I was just recently at an in-person meeting of the Habitat Strategic Initiative Advisory Team. And that's a state level advisory team to which I was appointed this year. And we basically help shape decision making around funding restoration projects. Mm-hmm. And so that group has just so many brilliant thinkers in it, and representing tribal interests, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, folks from Friends of San Juan's and other island organizations, also folks from jurisdictions on the mainland. Mm-hmm. And it's just a really neat place to realize how many great thinkers are working on these problems. And the solutions to these problems are going to have to be varied and numerous. But a lot of it comes down to, can we enforce environmentally protective laws? If so, how and by whom? What jurisdiction is willing to be the enforcer? Can we resource the scale of conservation, acquisition, and restoration that's needed? And, is there the potential of buying out shoreline property owners? Because as long as the investment in owning a home on the shore is the driving factor for decision making, and as long as those decisions are left to private property owners to fight for hard armoring, even though the science shows that it will not provide long-term protection of that home or that septic system, and that it is going to destroy habitat on site and adjacent to the site, we have a fundamental conflict of interest if we're telling people that they don't have an alternative except to slowly lose their resource of a shoreline home and or strive to destroy habitat by building hard armoring, even though it's not advised.
Yeah, I mean, I think a buyback program that's my favorite. I'm always going to talk about the buyback program because it's the only way that I see people who've made investments, being willing to give up that investment without totally going underwater. However, it requires taxpayers at large to see that as a value, right?
And frankly, Washington State has shown its will around protecting the environment and having a climate responsive stance. And Washington State has the opportunity to tax people differently than it does. Mm-hmm. Washington State could think about the revenue side of things. And, I also serve as a school board member, and I know that the context for schools is shaped completely by public funding. Yeah. Shaped completely by how our public schools are funded by Washington State, and of course, dwindling federal funding. Mm-hmm. And then there are, local taxes and local levies that can help. But as long as this conversation is around how do we do more with this relatively constrained budget, and there are competitions between various priorities that are all truly important, we're probably not going to solve any of these big problems. But if we were considering taxing the rich, for example, as a theoretical solution, we probably could make great strides in funding what's most important for the well-being of all, including those who have the capacity to pay more so that we can have the quality of life and health that keeps Washington State thriving.
Yeah. And I think that this becomes really important in this current moment. I think just because of what is happening at the federal level. I don't know if you saw, but last week, Trump, their KUOW had an article about how Trump basically pulled out of the agreement meant to restore salmon on the Columbia River, which impacts, our region particularly. And so if our federal government in this moment is not going to be reliable for environmental protection, for basic human rights, right? Then, it does kind of fall to our local governments and our state government to pick up the mantle of being the champion for our environment and for the people who live in our state.
Right. Right. Yeah. The current moment is so devastating that it's almost hard to think about without despairing. Mm-hmm. And yet there's so much heartening news locally in terms of what commitments Washington State has made.
Yes.
Commitments individual jurisdictions have made within Washington State, how Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and tribal governments are working together, how California is working together to protect the Pacific Ocean, mm-hmm. and Washington and BC can collaborate around preservation and stewardship of the full Salish Sea. Mm-hmm. So it's devastating to see agreements with tribes be forsaken by this federal government. It's devastating to see hard-won victories in environmental agreement making thrown aside.
Yes.
And yet I am still heartened by being able to work locally to improve and enforce the rules that protect our lands and waters. And it's really at the heart of why WEAN exists. You know, WEAN for almost 40 years has basically had the stance of ecosystems are vital. We need them to live. And the rules that protect them should be better and should be enforced. And so one of the reasons that we sometimes litigate is that the laws that protect nature matter. And as a watchdog organization, we're here to make sure that what matters is what happens on the ground.
You know, when you put it that way about what the fundamental purpose of WEAN is, I think that that's really a testament to the strength of the foundation that our founders, Marion and Steve, created, because that's still what it is today. Like through leadership transition, you know, you and I are the ones doing it now. And we do it differently, you know, mm-hmm. like we should, but I think the core foundational principles are the same. Because right. The world has changed, right? Now we're thinking about climate resiliency in a way that Marion and Steve were not necessarily in 1975 or 1988, you know, but it's still within the context of we need to protect our ecosystems to live.
Right.
We need the laws to protect our ecosystems to work, you know?
And I think our theory of action is evolving. You know, Marion and Steve are both legal experts and ecosystem scientists. So they were able to individually analyze and act and, you know, have the force of a dozen people just as individual authors and scrutinizers of the public record and the environment on, you know, in real time. They could walk the land and see what was going on and report about it. We have this theory, which is that if we educate more people to understand civic engagement and to feel empowered to lend their voice to shaping the decisions of people in positions of power, that will expand the influence beyond the staff or the volunteers of WEAN to an empowered community. We also see that Washington State seems to be doing a better job keeping its environmental promises than some of our local jurisdictions are doing. Mm-hmm. And so we're advocating within our local jurisdictions and beyond to Washington State to say, in addition to improving environmentally protective laws, can you enforce them? Mm-hmm. In addition to asking counties to plan, can you ask counties to plan responsibly with public participation? Mm-hmm. In addition to, you know, constraining the rights of shoreline property owners to build bulkheads, can you think about how to fund the removal of bulkheads and the restoration of habitat? And so, you know, we're really doing the work that Marion and Steve and the founding members have always done, but we're trying to expand it both vertically and laterally, you know, laterally to bring more people into having empowered voice for nature, and vertically to call upon senior jurisdictions, namely Washington State, to adopt some global solutions that'll serve all coastal communities. And then aside from the sea level issue, all communities that have forests, all communities that have prairies, all communities that have urban ecosystems, and cities where people deserve to be able to walk on a lawn and see a native flower.
Yeah. I do think that, Marion and Steve did do the work of 12 people each, probably. And that strategy worked for them for their time. But I think it is going to require our entire community to be engaged, involved, and educated in order for us to really make the changes that we need to make as a society today. In our given time, in our given circumstance, we're not in a position where we can just put the load on the backs of two people and pat them on the back and say, great job.
Right. Yeah, they often tell this old story about how people would compliment them on, doing such great, important work. And they would say, well, do you have any time? People would say, well, no, I'm very busy. And then they would say, well, do you have any money? And then generally people might consider becoming a member or donating. Mm-hmm. But, right now what we need to do is support more people to realize that participating in public processes and lending your voice to decision makers is part of being a member of society. And this local empowerment is such a great antidote to the despair that comes with looking at national and international news. Mm-hmm. Because, I have very little control over, for instance, our nation's offensive military strategies. Mm-hmm. Hot topic this week.
Yes.
But I do have a voice right here at home about, will I comment on the environmental impact statement related to our local growler flights? And do I care about the impact of those flights on nesting endangered shorebirds? I do care, and I can participate, and my comments do make it into the public record. And, cumulatively, if enough of us speak up, change will start at home.
Yeah, I agree. We want your money and your time, to be clear.
We do. Yes. In fact, we want your money, your time, and your membership, because as a membership organization, that's one super important way to participate.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a break for the rest of the summer because, as you've just heard, we have a lot going on, and I won't have time for podcasts. So sorry, everyone. If you haven't listened to everything yet, go back and listen. If you've already listened to everything, you can email me and give me suggestions for episodes in the fall. And that would be great. Another man up in the pulpit in the State House. Head of the table with a black pen, scratching egos, talking too loud. Externalize every outcome, every warm gun, every profit. Kneeling down to the flashing numbers, the NASDAQ, the cold constructs. Running backwards to just keep moving, just keep moving, just keep moving. I'm learning every lesson that our mothers tried to teach us. This podcast is a production of the Whidbey Environmental Action Network and is made possible by our generous donors. Produced, edited, and mixed by me, Amanda Bullis. Special thanks to Marianne and Steve for their years of service through action and for lending their voices to this podcast. To WEAN's Executive Director, Marnie Jackson, and our board for their leadership. Special thanks to Whidbey musician Nathaniel Talbot for letting us use his track Intuition from the album Animal, available on Bandcamp. Workplace, every day on your paycheck, a volume of confidence against the idea of your body being put into your own hands. So please don't hold it, please don't hold it, please don't hold it back. Unleash the power, the straight logic of compassion. What I need now ain't that old religion or the cold hard facts. Just need a woman in which get us on track.
of a false man's allegory, slowly erasing that old violence from the story. Recoupling emotion, slow emotion to intelligence, granting the planters, healers, teachers, feelers a new relevance. What I need now ain't that old religion or the code